and he's more of the optimist nature, and I'm more of the pessimist nature. So I wonder where Eric Sammons fits on the scale, and he joins us now. Good morning to you, Eric.
Good morning. How are you doing, Joe?
Praise be to God, I am alive, and that counts.
Yeah. Well, I know my kids call me a pessimist, but I try not to be.
I guess that counts too. Amen. Praise be to God.
Teenagers are eternal optimists. So, for teenagers, everybody's a pessimist who's older than like 25.
This article is interesting because it continues to paint a very bad picture, does it not? I mean, I have for years now referenced the CARA statistics that are maintained on Georgetown University's website, and they go back 50 years, and there's no positives in those statistics. They're all incredibly negative, and these are the same stats that the USCCB references. And on every level, they're like just negative, negative, negative. Everything is down. Everything is bad. Everything is, and then you put up this article, and I'm like, oh, boy, and facepalm, right? But here's what was interesting to me. So essentially, the article's looking at the stats that came out, what was it, a month ago now, maybe, the Gallup poll?
Yeah, about a few weeks ago, yeah.
And basically, what did it tell us? What is this chart trying to say to us?
I think as Catholics, what it really, the big takeaway is that the problems we've had in the Catholic Church of people leaving in droves, especially since the year 2000, extends beyond the Catholic Church and into all religions in America. That essentially, it's startling, actually, that starting in the year 2000, people just stopped being identified with church membership. And that includes synagogues and mosques as well. That essentially America became radically less religious starting in the year 2000. I mean, because the studies Gallup did started in the 1930s, and for 70 years, essentially the number of people, Americans, who said they're a member of a church, synagogue, or mosque was around 70%. 75%. I mean, it's very consistent. It was amazingly consistent. And then starting in the year 2000, that number starts to drop very quickly. And the big news was, for the first time ever, it dropped below 50% this year. It was 47%. So more people say they're not a member of a church than say they are a member of a church in America. And if you know America's history, you know how religious we are. I mean, especially in comparison, for example, to modern Europe. We're a very religious nation. I mean, mostly Protestant, but we're just very religious. And now we just aren't. In this century, we stopped being religious. And so I think that should give us all pause, us religious people, I should say, what's going wrong? Why is everybody heading for the door? Not just in the Catholic Church, but also in Protestant denominations and synagogues and mosques as well.
Eric, I know you're coming out with a book in about a month, and we'll have to have you back on and talk about that. And the title of the book kind of triggers something in my mind. Obviously, I haven't read it yet, but it's something seems to be something that I've been talking about a lot to my theology professor when I was at University of St. Thomas, and that's if we kind of fall into this religious indifferentism where we kind of say, well, it's possible to be saved outside of the church. It's possible, theoretically, that under very certain circumstances, someone might be able to have invincible ignorance, then they will be saved anyways. I feel like that has been has had a huge effect on our evangelization and on so many people leaving the church and then not trying to bring them back. Could you speak on that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the purpose of my upcoming book, Deadly Indifference, is the idea of that we become religiously indifferent, meaning we don't really think it matters. I mean, down deep, we don't think it matters whether or not you're religious, but especially what religion you are. And I saw this time and time again when I was working on the diocesan level, the parish level, that most Catholics just simply don't think it matters for eternal salvation or even for day-to-day life whether or not you're Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or Jewish or atheist. It just doesn't. As long as you're a good person, that's all that really matters. And if that's the case, why would people stay? I mean, it's kind of like if your marketing is, well, it doesn't really matter if you buy our product, then who's going to buy the product, right? And so when that's basically what the Catholic Church is saying, and other denominations and Protestant denominations as well are saying that it doesn't really matter if you belong to us, well, then most people are going to say, well, I'm not going to belong to you then. And so I think that's a big takeaway I think we should have, which is we should tell them, why does it matter? I mean, first of all, we need to know personally, why does it matter to be Catholic? Why does it matter both here on earth, but after we die? And once we know that, we need to tell others why it matters so that they are at least realize that there is a distinct difference between being Catholic and not being Catholic. Now, they may reject our message. That happened to Jesus himself. But ultimately, they at least should know there is a real difference between being Catholic and not being Catholic.
And just to play devil's advocate, because this is the response I've heard to that, people say that, well, even if it's not a matter of salvation, we should try to evangelize out of love, to bring people to the fullness of truth. But Eric Sammons, could you explain why that just doesn't have the same sort of urgency?
Well, first I would say, according to traditional Catholic teaching, it does matter for salvation. But I know what you're saying, and the truth is that, I mean, there's so many different ways that it matters, because if we really believe what Jesus Christ taught us and what the Catholic Church has taught for 2,000 years, we know that there's a fundamental difference between being Catholic and not being Catholic. The number one difference is the sacraments. Only in the Catholic Church do we receive the sacraments, can we receive the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And that has a fundamental difference in our life. And so if we try to act like it doesn't really matter, that we're all just getting to heaven anyway, first of all, it goes against Catholic teaching. I mean, the Church has always traditionally saw these extraordinary means of salvation, meaning people who are outside the visible confines of the Church being saved, as truly extraordinary. In other words, it's up to God if he wants to do that. But for us, we need to look at it like, no, the ordinary means of salvation is the Catholic Church. And so we need to urge others to become Catholic and to let them know it really does matter, and that you really do put your salvation in jeopardy if you're not a member of the Catholic Church.
Eric Sammons is our guest. He's got this article on Crisis. He is the editor of Crisis, by the way, but the article is called America is a Pagan Nation. Now what? And we're going to link to it on our social feed so you can read it for yourself, or you can just go to crisismagazine.com. You'll find it there. I want to ask you about some of the dates on this chart that's in your article that I find interesting. Of course, we mentioned earlier, it starts in, I think, was it 1930, someplace in the 1930s. It begins to chart, and it's generally averaging somewhere around 71% or so, all the way up until you get to around 1990, just before 1990, late 80s, early 90s, it drops down below 70, but then right just before 2000, it ticks up again to 70%. I wonder, do you think that might be because of Y2K?
I never thought of that. It is possible. I mean, I think the numbers were still generally close enough that I think we probably could give it just margin of error.
Got it.
In the 1990s, that we're still at 68, 69%. And I'm willing to just round that to the nearest, tens and say that's still around 70%. It's really after 2000 that all of a sudden we just see it start to plummet.
Well, the reason why I bring that up is because you remember 9/11 and how right after 9/11, churches were packed, people were praying.
Absolutely.
That's very typical around disasters, tragedies, things like that. People tend to go back to God, which is, unfortunately, that it takes that for us to return to God. But I wondered if that was part of the trends here, if we're looking at the data. But let's bring up what you just said. Why at 2000 do we see this significant downturn that leads us to now, which is down below 50% for the first time since we've been keeping the data? What do you attribute as the main cause to this major downfall since the year 2000? What was it in 2000 that might have shifted things?
I don't think we can say there's one main cause. I think there's a number of them, and if you go to the article, obviously listeners can read a number of my thoughts of what would be. I've come to believe that I think maybe one of the primary things is the rise of the internet as a social community. Obviously, in the 1990s is when the internet really took off as a public thing for the average person to get on. I was very involved in internet startup at the time, so I know a lot about that time frame. But I really feel like it was in the 2000s that we start seeing the rise of YouTube, of Facebook, and then later Twitter, and before this even MySpace, things like that. But it started to create communities where people were able to, at least they felt they were able to, fulfill their community needs on the internet. They didn't, and the local church has historically been a way in which people joined together, had that community, which every person needs. We're all social beings, so we need that community. And now all of a sudden, you could just sit in your basement on the computer, and you could really get in depth with people who had the same interests as you, the most obscure interests you could have. You could find a community that you could really tap into. There's no need to get off your seat and go to church on Sunday and get that. Now, we know that church, that's not the only thing about church is community, but it is an important part of going to church community. So I feel like the rise of the internet really, as a social community aspect of it, during that time, I think has really been a major cause of people no longer saying, I'm a member of this church, but instead, I'm a member of this Reddit community. I'm a member of this Facebook group, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time with you, Eric, but I wondered, now that we've had streaming masses for the better part of a year, will people come back, or do they feel even more entrenched in those digital communities than ever before?
Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge for the church, and as I mentioned in my article, I think the church needs to zag when everybody else is zigging, which means I think we need to really do what nobody else is doing and show people we have something nobody else has, which is the sacrament. And so I'm not a fan of the streaming masses. I understand the necessity for them for a time, but I think we really need to emphasize you need to be at church and receive physically the sacrament, because you will literally get that nowhere else in the world.
Amen. Praise be to God. Eric Sammons, editor of Crisis Magazine. Thank you for your time today. We're very grateful to you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. God bless you. God love you. All right. We're going to go to a break. We're going to come back. We're going to have breaking news and stories with EmilyiAlcaraz, and then Austin Ruse from CFAM is going to be on.